In a room filled with the scent of expensive silk and vintage champagne, the deadliest thing isn't the poisoned wine. It's the man holding the door. Power is often blind to its own shadow, but Michel Volz sees every flicker of darkness. 4 months she has moved through the high-stakes world of the Slover syndicate like a ghost, a quiet waitress in a blue apron who notices the things powerful men ignore. She sees the way a hand lingers too long near a jacket, the way a professional mask slips into a cold, predatory focus, and the way death waits patiently in the eyes of a trusted driver. Glen Slover is a man chiseled from marble and malice, a boss who rules with a quiet, suffocating force. He is a master of his domain, yet he is seconds away from becoming a memory. As he takes a dominant step toward his car, he is unaware that the air has already dropped 10 degrees with the intent of his execution. The only thing standing between the Mafia's most powerful man and his final breath is a slim girl with wide, anxious eyes. When Michel reaches out and grips his black silk tie, she isn't just fixing a stray fold, she is stalling a kingdom's collapse. One urgent whisper in the heat of a crowded gala is about to rip apart a carefully constructed empire of lies and turn a terrified Maid into the most dangerous weapon in the room. The scent of floor wax and expensive furniture was the atmosphere Michel Volz breathed every day, a sterile perfume that signaled safety. In the sprawling Slover estate she was a shadow among shadows, a girl in a blue apron whose primary duty was to be part of the architecture. She moved through the grand hallways with a silent, rhythmic grace, her soft features and simple ponytail ensuring that no one ever looked twice. This invisibility was her sanctuary. For the last 6 months, Michel had traded her identity for the comfort of a housekeeper's routine. While she polished the heavy mahogany banisters and dusted the cold marble statues, she practiced the art of being unremarkable. In a world governed by men like Glen Slover, men who radiated a terrifying, kinetic energy, being unnoticed was the only way to stay alive. She had spent years in a previous life analyzing high-stakes surveillance, learning to read the subtle shifts in a target's posture or the minute dilation of a pupil. Now those same skills were dedicated to ensuring she never made eye contact with the wrong person. Glen Slover was the epicenter of the estate's gravity. He was a man chiseled from late-night negotiations and the weight of a fracturing empire, his tall, muscular frame usually dressed in sharp, dark three-piece suits that acted as armor. Michel watched him from the corners of her eyes, cataloging his moods by the tightness of his jaw or the way he paced the library when the phones went silent. To the rest of the staff he was a volatile storm to be avoided. To Michel he was a complex set of data points she studied to maintain her own distance. Her life was a series of quiet observations. She knew which of the guards carried their tension in their shoulders and which of the underbosses had a tell when they were lying to the boss. She heard the heavy, threatening conversations that echoed through the vents, the whispers of betrayal and the logistics of power, yet she kept her head down and her cloth moving. She was the girl who saw everything and said nothing, a human camera recording the slow-motion collision of rival families from behind a tray of espresso. The blue apron she wore was more than a uniform, it was a disguise. It told the world she was subservient, that her mind was occupied with the count of linen napkins rather than the tactical vulnerabilities of the men in the room. Even when the air in the mansion grew thick with the metallic scent of impending violence, Michel remained a ghost. She had escaped a past where her eyes were a liability, and here in the cold opulence of the Slover kingdom, she intended to remain a silent witness to a story she never meant to join. But as she stood in the periphery of a world built on blood and secrets, she knew that even the most perfect invisibility has a breaking point. The air in the grand ballroom was a thick, suffocating blend of expensive perfume and cold ambition. Crystal chandeliers hummed overhead, casting a fractured, diamond-like light over the assembly of the city's most dangerous elite. Michel moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility she had spent months perfecting, her blue apron replaced by the crisp white shirt and dark vest of the catering staff. Her tray of champagne flutes remained steady, a silver shield between her and the predators in tuxedos. Glen Slover was the sun around which the room orbited. He stood near the center of the gilded space, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette in an all-black three-piece suit. He looked every bit the chiseled monument of power, his jawline tight and alert as he navigated a minefield of polite threats and fragile alliances. To the casual observer he was a man in total control, but Michel, watching from the periphery, noticed the slight tension in his dominant posture. The way he remained mid-step even when standing still, a man perpetually ready for a storm. As she drifted toward the heavy oak doors that led to the circular driveway, Michel's focus shifted to the perimeter. This was where her old life and her new one collided. Her eyes, trained by years of studying the mechanics of threat, naturally gravitated toward the men who weren't drinking. She saw him through the towering glass panes of the entrance. Marcus, Glen's personal driver. He was a man chiseled from the same professional stoicism as the car he drove, an athletic and clean-cut figure who had been part of Glen's shadow for years. Usually, Marcus was as unreadable as the armored glass of the limousine, standing at attention with a stoic, immovable grace. But tonight something was vibrating beneath the surface. Michel paused, her fingers tightening on the edge of her silver tray. Marcus was pacing, a tight, controlled circle that suggested a predator waiting for a signal. In the biting evening air, a fine sheen of sweat coated his brow, a physical anomaly that screamed of a rising internal temperature. Then she saw the tell that stopped her breath. Marcus reached inside his tailored jacket, his hand lingering over his heart. It wasn't a gesture of comfort or a check for a phone. His fingers remained gripped, his knuckles white as he adjusted the weight of a weapon tucked into an impractical position. Not the shoulder holster meant for protection, but a deep-set carry meant for a quick, close-range draw. His expression, usually a mask of professional loyalty, had curdled into a cold, predatory focus. He wasn't looking for threats coming toward the boss. He was looking for the moment Glen would turn his back. The realization hit Michel like a physical blow. The driver wasn't waiting to take Glen home. He was waiting to take his life. The ballroom, with its glittering lights and soft classical music, suddenly felt like a tomb. Michel looked back at Glen, who was currently laughing at a dark joke from a rival capo, entirely unaware that the man he trusted with his life had already aimed a metaphorical gun at his head. The invisible wall Michel had built around herself started to crumble. She was no longer just a witness to a story. She was the only person in the room who knew the ending. With a dry throat and a racing heart, she set her tray down on a nearby marble console and began to move toward the center of the room, her eyes locked on the black silk tie at Glen Slover's throat. The transition from the periphery to the center of the room felt like walking through deep water. Michel's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone, but her legs moved with a sudden, icy purpose. Every second she delayed was a second Marcus moved closer to the point of no return. She ignored the curious glances of the security detail and the brush of silk against her arms as she wove through the high society vultures. Her world had narrowed down to a single point, the back of Glen Slover's neck and the black silk tie that anchored his presence. Glen was mid-step, his dominant posture radiating a quiet authority as he prepared to exit toward the driveway. He was a man who moved with the expectation that the world would part for him, and it did, until Michel reached out. With a boldness that felt like a death sentence, she stepped into his personal space. Her fingers, trembling yet firm, latched onto the smooth fabric of his tie just below the knot. The physical contact was an electric shock. Glen stopped instantly, his body tensing into a weapon. His jawline sharpened, and his dark eyes flashed with a mixture of alert aggression and sheer, bewildered confusion. No one touched Glen Slover without permission, let alone a waitress with wide, terrified eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the air between them. He didn't pull away, he loomed over her, a mountain of muscle and suppressed violence, waiting for a reason to break her. Michel didn't blink. She leaned in, her soft features pulled tight by urgency, bringing her lips inches from his ear. To the rest of the room, it looked like a devoted servant fixing a stray fold in his lapel. To Glen it was the moment the world shifted. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice a jagged thread of steel. "The driver is sweating in the cold. He's reaching for a gun in his jacket and it's not positioned for your protection. If you walk through those doors, you're walking into your own execution." She felt the immediate violent change in his physiology. The muscle in his jaw corded, and his breathing hitched for a fraction of a second as he processed the data. He didn't look at the doors, he looked at her. For the first time, Glen Slover wasn't seeing a waitress or a ghost in a blue apron. He was seeing a woman who had just stepped into the line of fire to drag him back from the edge. "How do you know?" he breathed, his hand coming up to hover near her wrist, not to remove her hand, but as if to anchor himself to the truth she was providing. "He's not scanning the crowd, Glen. He's scanning you," Michel replied, her grip on his tie tightening as if she could physically hold him in the safety of the ballroom. His hand hasn't moved from his chest in 3 minutes. "Don't look, don't react. Just stay exactly where you are." For a heartbeat, they stood frozen in a strange, intimate tableau, the powerful boss and the trembling girl, connected by a strip of black silk and a lethal secret. The gala continued to hum around them, a gilded cage of noise and light, while outside, the cold hand of betrayal waited for a signal that would never come. Glen's eyes searched hers, looking for a lie, but all he found was the raw, frantic honesty of a woman who had finally decided to be seen. He didn't pull back. Instead, he shifted his weight, shielding her body with his own, the predator finally realizing that the most vital person in his empire was the one he had never bothered to notice. The tension in Glen's body didn't just rise. It solidified into something lethal. He didn't look toward the glass doors, but his peripheral vision was locked on the silhouette of Marcus by the limousine. With a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, he caught the eye of his head of security, Elias, who was standing 20 feet away. The communication was silent. A jagged, predatory understanding passed between them. Glen's hand finally moved, not to push Michel away, but to rest heavily on her shoulder, a gesture that served as both a shield and a silent command to stay still. Elias and 2 other guards drifted toward the entrance with the practiced nonchalance of professional killers. They didn't draw their weapons yet. They simply closed the distance, their hands resting near their hips. The ballroom's music seemed to dim, the laughter of the guests becoming a muffled background noise to the localized storm brewing at the door. Marcus, sensing a shift in the air, began to turn, his hand diving deeper into his jacket. He was too slow. The neutralization was surgical. Before Marcus could clear leather, Elias had closed the gap, his arms snaking around the driver's throat while the other 2 guards pinned his limbs against the cold metal of the Maybach. There was no gunfire, just the muffled sound of a struggle and the heavy thud of a man being forced to the asphalt. Within seconds, Marcus was dragged into the shadows of the estate's service wing, leaving the driveway empty and the threat effectively erased. Glen finally exhaled, a long, controlled breath that signaled the return of his terrifying focus. He turned back to Michel, his grip on her shoulder tightening just enough to be felt. The confused, alert expression he had worn moments ago was gone, replaced by an icy, analytical stare that seemed to strip away her blue apron and her carefully constructed disguise. He steered her away from the center of the room, guiding her toward a private alcove draped in heavy velvet. "The driver was a decade-deep asset," Glen said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "He was vetted by the best. He was invisible to everyone but me. And yet you saw him." Michel felt the walls closing in. The invisibility that had been her sanctuary for months was gone, shattered by her own intervention. She kept her eyes lowered, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. "I just saw the signs, Mr. Slover." He wasn't himself. Glen stepped closer, invading her space until she was pressed against the cold stone of the alcove. He reached out, his finger hooking under her chin and forcing her gaze upward to meet his. His dark eyes were burning with a mixture of suspicion and a strange, newfound fascination. "Don't lie to me," he commanded, the authority in his voice absolute. A maid notices a smudge on a glass or a wrinkle in a rug. A maid does not identify a tactical ambush from 30 yards through a tinted window. You didn't just see a nervous man, you saw a threat profile. The silence between them stretched, thick with the scent of the gala and the weight of her secrets. Michel could see the gears turning in his mind, the realization that he had been harboring a high-level observer in his own house. "I want to know who you really are, Michel Volz," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "I want to know why a woman with your eyes is wasting her life serving drinks to men who aren't half as smart as she is. Because tonight you saved my life. And in my world that means I own your story." Michel looked at the man chiseled from marble and malice, and for the first time she didn't want to hide. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a spark of the woman she used to be, the woman who saw the world in patterns and tells. She realized that the blue apron would never fit her again. The ghost of Sands Point was dead, and in its place stood a woman who had just become the most valuable asset in the Slover empire. The air in the private alcove felt thinner, charged with the weight of Glen's undivided attention. He didn't step back. Instead he seemed to loom larger, his presence a dark, physical pressure that demanded the truth Michel had spent months burying. The gala hummed on the other side of the velvet curtains, a distant world of hollow laughter, but here the silence was sharp enough to bleed. I grew up in the shadow of a lens, Michel began, her voice barely a whisper yet steady. She didn't look away from his burning gaze. My father was a technician for the state. He didn't teach me how to play, he taught me how to watch. By 12 I could tell if a man was lying by the rhythm of his blink. By 20 I was a primary analyst for a firm that handled high-stakes corporate surveillance. I was the person they called when they suspected a leak in the boardroom. Glen's hand remained on her chin, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a slow, contemplative rhythm that made her skin prickle. He was processing the value of the asset he had accidentally stumbled upon. And why is an elite analyst scrubbing floors in Long Island? Because the last leak I found wasn't a corporate secret. It was a government contract for a private military firm. They didn't want the leak plugged. They wanted the witness erased, she said, the memory of the fire and the screaming tires momentarily clouding her wide eyes. I realized that to the powerful, people like me are just tools to be used until we're blunt. So I made myself invisible. I chose a blue apron because no one looks at the help. No one expects the girl clearing the dishes to be mapping the room's tactical exits. Glen let out a low, dark chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He released her chin, but he didn't move away. He began to pace the small space, his muscular frame moving with the predatory grace of a man who had just found a new weapon. You spent months pretending to be a ghost while my empire was rotting from the inside. You watched my lieutenants, you listened to my calls, and you stayed silent. I was surviving, Mr. Slover, she countered, her voice gaining a thin edge of defiance. He stopped, turning to face her with a look of terrifying clarity. Survival is a luxury I no longer grant you for free. You've seen too much, Michel. You've proven that you can see through the masks my own security can't penetrate. That makes you the most dangerous person in this house. He stepped back into her space, his expression shifting into something colder, more transactional. The boss had returned and the grace period was over. You have two paths tonight. My men are currently taking Marcus to the basement. I could send you down there with him. I could ensure your silence the traditional way, and by tomorrow the ghost of Sands Point would simply be gone. Michel felt a chill travel down her spine, but she didn't flinch. She saw the second option in the way he adjusted his black tie, the very tie she had used to stall his death. Or, Glen continued, his voice dropping to a silken, authoritative drawl, you can trade that apron for a seat at my right hand. You will be my eyes. You will sit in every meeting, attend every sit-down, and scan every face. You will tell me who is breathing too fast and whose pulse is skipping. You will become the shadow that protects the throne. He reached out, his large hand hovering between them, an invitation and a threat wrapped in one. The basement or the inner circle, Michel. You wanted to be invisible, but that life ended the moment you touched my tie. Now you can either be a victim of my world or the architect of its survival. Choose. Michel looked at the hand, then up at the sharp, alert jawline of the man who had just claimed her future. The fear was still there, a cold weight in her stomach, but beneath it, the dormant analyst was stirring. She realized that she had been hiding from her gift for too long, and in this dark kingdom of marble and malice, it was the only thing that would keep her from being crushed. Slowly she reached out, her slim hand disappearing into his large, powerful grip. I don't want the basement, she whispered. Glen's lips curled into a slow, predatory smile. Good choice. Now go change. The blue apron is dead. From now on you wear black. The transformation was complete, at least on the surface. Michel stood before the full-length mirror in her new quarters, the blue apron replaced by a tailored black sheath dress that felt like a second skin. The fabric was expensive, silent, and sharp, much like the man who had provided it. She pulled her hair back into a sleek, low knot, removing the last traces of the invisible maid. When she stepped into the hallway, two guards she used to dust around stood at attention. She wasn't the help anymore. She was the variable. Glen was waiting for her at the entrance to the Grand Library, where the air was thick with the scent of aged tobacco and the heavy metallic tang of tension. He looked her over, his dark eyes tracing the transition from ghost to shadow with a slow, approving focus. He didn't offer a compliment. In his world, looking the part was a requirement, not an achievement. He simply adjusted his own black tie, the same one she had gripped in the gala, and nodded toward the heavy double doors. "The room is full of men who think they are smarter than me," Glen whispered, leaning down so his breath brushed her ear. "They've heard about Marcus. They're nervous, which makes them dangerous. I want you behind me, slightly to the left. Don't take notes. Don't speak. Just look. I want to know who is mourning the driver and who is celebrating the vacancy." They entered the room as a single unit of power. The 6 capos seated around the massive oak table fell silent, their eyes darting from Glen to the woman at his side. Michel felt the weight of their scrutiny, a mixture of dismissal and intense curiosity. To them, she was likely just the latest distraction, a trophy in black silk. She settled into her position, her pulse steadying as her internal analytical engine hummed to life. She stopped seeing men and started seeing data. The summit was a masterclass in suppressed hostility. Glen dominated the head of the table, his muscular frame leaning forward as he laid out the new security protocols. Michel scanned the faces. To the right, Capo Moretti was overcompensating, nodding too aggressively, his fingers drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm on the table. Classic anxiety, but likely born of fear rather than guilt. To the left, Salvatore remained a statue, but his eyes never moved toward Glen, always fixed on the exit, a sign of a man already planning his departure. Then her gaze landed on Arthur Vane, Glen's oldest and most trusted advisor. Arthur had been with the family since Glen was a boy. He was the architect of their legal shielding and the man who held the keys to the syndicate's offshore accounts. He was currently speaking, his voice smooth and reassuring as he argued for a measured response to the Calabrese family. Michel tightened her focus. Arthur looked perfect. His suit was impeccable, his posture relaxed. But then she saw it. Despite the library's aggressive air conditioning, a single tiny bead of moisture had formed at the base of Arthur's sideburn. It wasn't the sweat of a man who was hot. It was the localized perspiration of a man whose sympathetic nervous system was in a state of high alert. He tracked his hands. They were folded neatly on the table, but as he spoke about loyalty and the tragedy of Marcus's betrayal, his right thumb began to rub rhythmically against the side of his index finger. It was a self-soothing gesture, a repetitive motion used to ground oneself during a monumental lie. Michel's gaze shifted to his eyes. While the other capos were watching Glen, Arthur's pupils were slightly dilated, and his blink rate had slowed to an unnatural degree. He was hyper-focused, his brain working overtime to maintain the facade of the loyal advisor while his body betrayed the truth. He wasn't mourning Marcus. He was terrified of what Marcus might have said before he died. Glen shifted in his chair, a subtle cue for Michel. He didn't turn around, but he tilted his head back slightly, waiting. Michel didn't move a muscle, but she allowed her gaze to settle heavily on Arthur Vane, staring at the bead of sweat until Arthur's eyes flickered toward her. For a split second the mask slipped. She saw a flash of raw, jagged panic in the old man's eyes. The look of a prey animal realizing it has been spotted by something it didn't even know was hunting. The meeting continued, but the air in the library had changed. Michel had found the leak. The man holding the keys to the kingdom was the one trying to burn it down. As Glen stood to dismiss the capos, he felt the sharp, silent shift in Michel's energy. He knew she had found what she came for. The summit was over, but the hunt had just begun. The heavy library doors closed with a final echoing thud, sealing the capos and their secrets inside the room they had just vacated. Glen didn't speak immediately. He walked to the massive oak desk and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler. The ice clinked against the glass, a sharp, lonely sound in the sudden quiet. He turned, his gaze raking over Michel with a new, searing intensity. He hadn't missed the way she had pinned Arthur Vane with her eyes. "Arthur," Glen said, the name sounding like a curse. "He's been my father's shadow since before I could walk." "You're sure?" "He wasn't sweating because of the heat, Glen," Michel replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. "He's self-soothing. His thumb, his blink rate, he's terrified. He knows Marcus failed, and he knows the silence in this house is a countdown." Glen downed the drink in one swallow, his jawline tight. He set the glass down and walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she could see the dark gold flecks in his eyes. "The blue apron was a shield, Michel. It kept you invisible. But as of this afternoon, that shield is gone. You're not the girl who cleans the library anymore. You're the woman who knows the counselor is a traitor. He signaled to a woman waiting in the hallway, a stern, silent tailor who had arrived under the cover of the summit. Within the hour, Michel was ushered into a dressing suite that felt more like a preparation room for a soldier than a sanctuary for a lady. The simple black sheath she had worn for the meeting was removed, replaced by a series of garments designed for a different kind of war. The new uniform was black silk, but it wasn't delicate. It was a high-collared, sleeveless gown that moved like liquid smoke, paired with a structured blazer that hid the sharp lines of a compact communication device clipped to her waist. As the tailor cinched a belt of reinforced leather around her ribs, Michel felt the physical weight of her new reality. The fabric was beautiful, but it felt heavy, a shroud of status that broadcast her proximity to the throne. When she stepped back to the mirror, the ghost was nowhere to be found. The soft features she had used to blend into the wallpaper were now framed by the stark, unforgiving black of the syndicate's inner circle. She looked lethal. She looked like a target. You feel it, don't you? Glen's voice came from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, watching her reflection. The weight. It's heavier than the apron, Michel admitted, her hand instinctively rising to the hollow of her throat. That's the weight of a target, Glen said, walking into the room. He stood behind her, his large hands resting on her shoulders. In the mirror, they looked like a portrait of a dark monarchy, the muscular boss and his silent, all-seeing shadow. Every man who left that library is wondering who you are. By tomorrow, they'll be wondering how to remove you. You've traded your anonymity for power, Michel. In this world, you can't have both. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, obsidian-encrusted pin, the insignia of the Slover family's high command. He pinned it to her lapel, his fingers brushing against her skin with a lingering heat. The gesture was a branding. He was claiming her eyes, her mind, and her life. Michel looked at the reflection of the woman in black silk and realized that the fear she had felt as a maid was different now. It was no longer the fear of being stepped on. It was the fear of being the first one hit when the glass shattered. She had spent her life watching from the shadows, but now the lights were fixed directly on her. She was no longer the girl who noticed the gun. She was the reason the gun would be drawn. And as Glen's grip on her shoulders tightened, she knew there was no going back to the silence of the blue apron. The hunt for Arthur Vane was beginning, and she was the only one who could see the trail. The night air at the industrial pier was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, a cold, biting wind whipping the hem of Michel's black silk gown against her legs. The warehouse loomed ahead like a hollow ribcage of rusted iron and corrugated steel, the neutral ground chosen for the parley with the Calabrese faction. Glen walked a step ahead of her, his presence a dark, grounding force in the desolation. He didn't wear a coat, seemingly immune to the chill, his jawline set in that familiar, alert sharp edge that warned everyone he was a man on a hair trigger. "Stay close," he had murmured before they stepped out of the armored SUV. "And don't just look at the men in front of us. Look at the shadows they think they've hidden." Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of crates and flickering overhead lights that buzzed with a dying electricity. Arthur Vane was already there, standing near the makeshift meeting table with a poise that was almost too perfect. He looked every bit the loyal counselor, yet Michel couldn't help but notice the way his eyes avoided hers. He knew she was watching him. He knew she was the reason Marcus was gone. The Calabrese representatives arrived with a theatrical display of heavy footsteps and rattling chains. They were led by a man named Silvio, a jagged, scarred veteran of the streets who smiled with too many teeth. The parley was meant to be a simple exchange, a gesture of peace after the unfortunate incident with the driver, but the air in the warehouse felt pressurized, like a storm cell about to burst. As the men began to drone on about territories and percentages, Michel let the words fade into a background hum. He went to work. She scanned the catwalks 40 feet above their heads. Most of the guards there were standing in plain sight, their rifles held at low ready. That was the distraction. Her eyes drifted to the stacks of shipping containers draped in heavy oil-stained tarps. She saw a slight rhythmic shudder in the fabric of a tarp near the eastern corner, the kind of movement made by a person trying too hard to stay still. Then she looked back at Arthur. He was leaning in, whispering something to Glen, his hand moving to his chest in that same self-soothing rub she had identified in the library. He flicked his gaze toward the western rafters just for a millisecond. Michel's pulse didn't race, it slowed. This was the clarity she had been born for. She looked at the western rafters, squinting against the glare of a naked bulb. There, behind a rusted ventilation duct, she saw the dull, matte reflection of a telescopic lens. It wasn't pointed at the table. It was aimed at the empty space where Glen would have to stand to sign the ledger. She stepped forward, ignoring the surprised grunts of the Calabrese bodyguards. He didn't hesitate. She walked directly into Glen's space, her hand sliding into the crook of his arm, her body subtly turning him away from the western line of sight. "The tarp to the east," she whispered, her voice a low, lethal vibration against his suit jacket. 3 men. And a glass eye in the western rafters behind the vent. Arthur just signaled them. Glen didn't flinch. He didn't even stop the sentence he was speaking to Silvio. But Michel felt the muscles in his arm turn to granite beneath her touch. He reached out with his free hand, seemingly to pull a document closer, but his fingers grazed the obsidian pin on Michel's lapel. A silent acknowledgement. "The deal is off," Glen said, his voice dropping an octave into a register of pure, unadulterated menace. Silvio's smile vanished. "Excuse me. I don't sign papers in the company of ghosts," Glen growled. In one fluid motion, he pivoted, his heavy hand catching Arthur Vane by the throat and slamming him onto the oak table before the old man could react. "And I don't negotiate with men who sweat in the cold." The warehouse erupted. The first shot rang out from the rafters, the bullet whining off the concrete exactly where Glen's head had been a second before. Michel dove behind a heavy wooden crate as Glen's security team returned fire, the air filling with the deafening roar of high-caliber rounds and the smell of cordite. Through the chaos, Michel watched Glen. He wasn't a man in a panic, he was a storm in a suit. He moved with a terrifying, muscular grace, using Arthur's body as a shield while he drew his own weapon. He looked back at Michel once, a searing, intense look of fierce protection and dark pride. She had seen the trap before the teeth could snap shut. The parley was a bloodbath, but for the first time in her life, Michel wasn't afraid of the violence. She was the one who had choreographed the survival. Arthur Vane's betrayal had been brought into the light, and as the warehouse burned with gunfire, Michel knew there was no hiding the truth anymore. She was the shadow that kept the king alive. The ride back from the warehouse was a blur of high-speed turns and the rhythmic heavy thrum of rain against the armored glass. Inside the SUV, the air was thick with the scent of copper and the electric residue of the gunfight. Glen sat beside Michel, his hand still gripped tightly over hers, his thumb tracing the obsidian pin on her lapel as if grounding himself. He was silent, his jaw set in a line of such absolute tension that it seemed ready to snap. They didn't return to the main estate. Instead, the convoy diverted toward a secluded safe house, a brutalist concrete structure hidden deep within the pine barrens of the island. This was where the final threads would be pulled. When the heavy steel doors groaned shut behind them, Michel saw him. Arthur Vane was strapped to a heavy wooden chair in the center of the room, his face a map of bruises and broken pride. But he wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows behind him, silhouetted by the harsh glow of a single overhead bulb, was a man whose presence made the blood in Michel's veins turn to slush. He was a man who didn't belong in the world of the Mafia. He wore a gray, nondescript suit and wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light, giving him a vacant, insect-like appearance. This was Julian Vane, Arthur's son and more importantly Michel's former mentor from the surveillance firm. He was the man who had taught her how to see, and the man who had ordered her erasure when she saw too much. "Julian," Michel whispered, the name tasting like ash. The man stepped into the light, a thin, clinical smile stretching across his face. He looked at Michel not as a person, but as a project he had failed to finish. "I must admit, Michel, I didn't expect to find you here. I thought you had crawled into a hole to die. To find you at the right hand of a Slover. It's a fascinating variable." Glen felt the tremor in Michel's hand and stepped forward, his muscular frame shielding her. His voice was a low, vibrating growl. "He's the one, isn't he? The one you were hiding from." "He's the one who taught me that everyone has a profile, Glen," Michel said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. "And he's the one who thinks he knows mine." Julian laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I created your profile, Michel. I know that beneath that black silk you're still the girl who freezes when the stakes get too high. I know your anxiety is a physical weight. I know that if I tell you exactly how this ends, you'll believe me because you've already mapped the failure in your head. He turned his gaze to Glen. You think she's a weapon? She's a liability. She sees the truth, yes, but she lacks the stomach to act on it. My father was just the bank, I am the architect. And I know that Michel will eventually blink. Michel stepped out from behind Glen. The fear was there, a suffocating, familiar pressure. But for the first time she didn't try to push it away. She used it. She scanned Julian the way he had taught her, looking for the tiny, microscopic fractures in his clinical mask. You're wrong, Julian, she said, her voice cutting through the damp air of the safe house. You think you know my profile because you wrote the first chapter. But you forgot to account for the change in environment. She walked closer, stopping just out of his reach. Her eyes were wide, but they were no longer anxious. They were surgical. You're blinking every 4 seconds. Your left hand is in your pocket, gripping a set of keys, likely to the vehicle waiting in the rear alley. You're talking too much, Julian. In our world, the man with the upper hand doesn't need to explain why he's winning. You're stalling because you realized the moment I walked in that I'm not the girl from the firm anymore. She looked at the sweat on his upper lip, the slight tremor in his glasses. You taught me how to read a lie, and right now your entire body is screaming. You didn't come here to finish the coup. You came here to negotiate because you know the Slover empire isn't as fractured as you hoped. The clinical smile on Julian's face faltered. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. For the first time in her life, Michel saw her mentor look at her with genuine, unadulterated fear. Glen moved then, his heavy hand resting on the back of Michel's neck, a silent gesture of absolute trust. He looked at Julian with the bored indifference of a god about to crush an ant. She's right, isn't she? You're not an architect. You're just a ghost from her past who overstayed his welcome. Michel didn't look away as Glen signaled his men. She stood her ground, watching the final profile of her enemy as he realized that the ghost he had created was the one who had finally sentenced him. She wasn't the girl who froze anymore. She was the woman who had seen the end coming, and for the first time she was the one holding the pen. The dawn light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sands Point study, a cold, gray gold that failed to soften the hard edges of the room. Glen stood by the window, his silhouette a dark pillar against the awakening world. He had discarded his jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful forearms of a man who had personally dismantled a coup. Beside him, seated in the high-backed leather chair that had once belonged to his father, Michel looked less like a maid and more like the architect of the silence that now permeated the estate. The aftermath of the safe house had been a surgical purging. With Julian and Arthur gone, the infection that had threatened the Slover family was cauterized. The remaining capos had been summoned at dawn, not for a parley but for an execution of order. They had seen Michel standing at Glen's side, her eyes scanning their faces with a clinical, terrifying accuracy that made even the most hardened killers look at their own shoes. They knew now that there was no lying to the throne, not while she was the one holding the keys to their tells. Glen turned away from the window, his gaze settling on Michel. The intensity in his eyes hadn't faded, but it had shifted from the predatory heat of a protector to the deep, resonant respect of a partner. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug, and stopped just inches away. He reached out, his thumb tracing the obsidian pin on her lapel, a permanent fixture now on her black silk. They're terrified of you, Glen said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. More than they are of me. They know I can only kill them once. They know you can see the betrayal before they even have the courage to think it. Michel leaned into the warmth of his hand, her wide eyes reflecting a new kind of peace. The anxiety that had once defined her was gone, replaced by the heavy, grounding weight of power. Let them be afraid, she replied. Fear is a better shield than invisibility ever was. I spent my life trying to be a ghost so I wouldn't have to face the monsters. I didn't realize that the only way to beat them was to become the one who watches them in the dark. Glen leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, a rare moment of vulnerability in a world built on marble and malice. You saved a kingdom that didn't even know it was falling. From now on, nothing moves in this city without your eyes on it. We aren't just surviving anymore, Michel. We're untouchable. He moved to the oak desk, picking up a new silk tie, one of deep blood-red crimson, and handed it to her. It was a silent invitation, a ritual they had forged in the fire of the gala. Michel took the silk, her fingers steady and sure as she looped it around his neck. She stepped into his space, her movements fluid and devoid of the hesitation that had once made her shrink. As she tightened the knot, her eyes locked onto his, a silent promise between the man who held the gun and the woman who held the vision. The Slover Empire was no longer a fracturing collection of loyalties and lies. It was a fortress, built on the singular truth that while a bullet can end a life, a shadow can end an empire. Michel smoothed the fabric of his lapels, her hands lingering over his heart. She was no longer the girl in the blue apron, and she was no longer hiding from her past. She had found a dark kingdom where her gift wasn't a curse but a crown. As they stepped out of the study to face the new day, the guards at the door snapped to attention, their eyes fixed forward, afraid to even glance at the woman in black. The sun finally broke over the horizon, lighting up the Long Island Sound in a blaze of fire. Glen and Michel walked together toward the waiting car, a sovereign shadow and her king, proving to the world that the most dangerous weapon in any room is the one that sees everything.